It's the Christian Beer Show.
And this is a podcast that you've been doing?
Yes, this is a podcast that I have every Sunday. I started it on the pandemic because I like talking and I was stuck in my house, not being able to talk that much. And I thought that specifically in psychiatry, we bring a lot of people from suffering to coping, and maybe a select population. Sometimes they're able to go from coping to thriving. And I thought it would be a good idea to talk with a lot of people that I consider are thriving and enjoying their lives and have meaning in their lives, and then maybe have people being able to listen to it and to understand that thought process and what leads them to become who they are. And and you're
thriving.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I think you're a great candidate for that specific topic, in my opinion. I've heard your story so many times. So for everybody listening, this is Dr. Breitbart. He's the chair of psychiatry at Memorial Sloan Kettering. And he has a beautiful story that brought him to where he is right now. And I've heard it probably 8,000 times, but I really like it. And I think I just wonder if you want to tell us a little bit about like what led you to be a psychiatrist and what led you to specifically focus on cancer and psychiatry.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me, Christian. Thank you. I first need to ask you, how did it turn out that you've heard this story 8,000 times? Is it that I tell it so much? Or?
I guess I'm exaggerating, but I think that you mention it every once in a while when somebody new comes to psychiatry, or when somebody asks you, which happens a lot. I feel like a lot of people are very curious about your life, probably because I think it comes from the authenticity and inevitably when you're like in the moment telling what you feel in a sort of unusual way compared to the typical psychiatrist that you would talk to. The immediate question is like, who is this guy, right? Like, and then that comes up and then you're ready to answer that.
Right. Well, we've been interviewing new fellows, right, for next July.
Yeah.
And I like to interview the fellows because I feel like I want to see who the fellows are. I want to be able to be a part of. I want to be informed about how we select the fellows, but also I think that I can have a conversation with a fellow applicant that will be unique and completely different from any other interview that they will have in any other program, with any other chair of a department or training program director, because I'm not going to ask them the same questions like, so tell me what made you interested in psychiatry, or how did you get interested in consultation liaison psychiatry, or tell me about an interesting case. I actually get into a conversation with them about a number of things that no one else is ever going to really ask them, and in the process of this conversation, I almost always tell them my story, the story of how I got to become who I am and do the work that I do. And I try to explain to them that the work that you do, being a psycho-oncologist, for instance, or a CL psychiatrist, whatever, the work you do should be a reflection of who you are as a person. So basically, I end up telling my story because I ask them who they are and who do they want to become, and not only who they are, but what is their intention in the world. What is their, why are they here in this world to do? What is it that they intend to do with their lives? How do they intend to create a life of significance and have an impact on the world. And I make a presumption, actually, that most people actually eventually agree with, but I make a presumption that almost everyone who finds their way into the field of healthcare, cancer-related care, psychiatric, psychological aspects of dealing with cancer and things like that, I make an assumption that everyone is interested in suffering. And and then I'll also ask them a little bit about how they understand suffering, etc. And it's very interesting. A lot of people don't understand what suffering is. They may know it deep inside, but it's hard for them to express it. And maybe we can talk about that a little bit too, But I end up telling them my story because people have trouble. I do a lot of teaching over the course of my career. I love to teach, and that has to do with my intention, the intention I have with my, in terms of what the impact of my life should be. And I'll tell the story so it'll be clear. I like to teach, and I use the Socratic method. And there's an attending on our faculty who we both know, Dr. Kearney, who's a pediatric psychologist, who was a fellow about 10, 15, 20 years ago now. And she would come on rounds with me, and I would use the Socratic method. And I would basically ask the fellows questions until to the point in which they really didn't know the answer. And then I would keep, I basically, I think that even when you don't know the specific answer to a question, if you're someone who belongs at Sloan Kettering as a fellow or an attending, you should be ideally someone who, even if they don't know the answer, can somehow figure out the answer or approximate, get close to what the answer might be based on the things that they do know, So I really don't like it when people just give up and say, I don't know the answer, please, tell me.
Please tell me.
Yeah, I encourage them to try to figure it out, Well, you know this, and you know this, and you know this, and all those three things contribute to the answer to this. What do you think? But I actually made a few people cry, by pressing them. And Julia Kearney took me aside when she was a fellow, and she said, Bill, this is not helping. Making them cry doesn't help them. When you see that they really don't know the answer, have pity on them and give them the answer. So I sort of stopped doing that. I still use the Socratic method, and I to the point where people are a little uneasy, but I don't go so far as to make them cry. I tell them the answers ahead of time. So I'm really focused on, go ahead.
Yeah, what you just said makes me think of responsibility to the world a little bit. I guess I realized I never got the opportunity to round with you, and I definitely don't like crying in rounds. So in some ways I'm grateful that didn't happen, and then in other ways I'm kind of like I want it to happen at some point to see how far we go into that Socratic method. But what you were saying, it makes me think of my responsibility for my life and how much as human beings we take responsibility for our lives and our outcomes in our lives and our, even like the seeking of our personal happiness. If we give up and wanted to get that happiness like somebody else to give it to us, we are kind of like doomed to failure in some way.
Yeah. Well, responsibility is a very interesting thing, right? On some level, it's an existential obligation, right? Kierkegaard taught us a few hundred years ago, he hypothesized that human beings were unique amongst all forms of life. And he may have been, amongst all animals, he may have been wrong. There might be a few animal species that actually have this ability as well as human beings, but we certainly have this unique ability, rather unique ability. Kierkegaard thought that human beings were unique in the fact that they were able to be aware of their existence, that they could objectively contemplate themselves, and that in fact, at some moment in life, at some point in life, you become aware. Oh my God, and you may not say my God, but you say, oh my, I'm here. Now what? What do I do with this fact that I exist? Another way of asking the question is, what is my ability to respond to the fact that I exist, that I'm alive? Therefore, the existential term responsibility. What is my ability to respond to that I exist? Your existential obligation is to create a life. All right? You need to create a life. And you need to create a very specific kind of life. You need to create the life of a Homo sapien, a human being. Can't create the life of a dog. You can't create the life of you can only create the life of a human being, the animal that we are. Human is the animal that we are. Being is this suggestion, this belief that perhaps we are unique compared to other animals in the sense that we are beings. We have an essence that is unique to us. And that essence may be composed of what people might describe as what is unique about human beings, our ability to experience certain kinds of experiences, like spiritual experiences or mystical experiences, or the experience of awe. You can be sitting at the edge of the Grand Canyon and looking out at the grandeur of the Grand Canyon and grandeur of nature, and you can be overwhelmed by the beauty of nature and the expanse of the Grand Canyon, and feel the particles of your body connecting with all the particles of nature and the universe, and you can feel infinite and endless and forever, but that rat that's sitting next to you looking at the Grand Canyon cannot have that experience. So it's that being, the essence part of our ability to experience awe. So you need to create a life of who you are. Now, Kierkegaard also said that once you become aware of your life, that you exist, you have two overwhelming emotions: the emotion of dread and the emotion of awe. The emotion of dread is basically this idea that, oh my God, I exist, but I'm mortal, I'm finite, and I die at some point. And in fact, I could die at any moment. It could happen at any moment. I really can't even predict it at this point. It could happen at any moment. It could happen during this interview, Christian.
It could happen right now.
Right now, yeah. And so that's a very important fact, and it's related to this. It's related to and then the other experience is awe, the experience of the beauty of life, what it feels like to fall in love, what it feels like to love a parent or a child, what it feels like to love God, to be in love with nature, beauty, art, music, film, food, to experience joy, right? To experience the joy of something painful, even like your own death or the birth of a child, So awe is it's this wonderful thing. It's basically what Albert Hoffman experienced when he was experimenting as a young scientist in Switzerland in what became Bayer Laboratories, was trying to isolate ergot alkaloids from fungus on rice seeds. He accidentally, what he isolated was lysergic acid, and he accidentally ingested it. And then he went home, and suddenly he had this experience of awe, the grandeur. Every blade of grass was so like distinct and beautiful, and the smells of everything. And he just experienced life. He experienced ecstasy. He became bigger than his body.
Mm-hmm.
He was no longer defined by the limitations of his physical body. That's awe. And that's how we feel when we experience ecstasy, not the drug ecstasy, but the ecstasy of falling in love. This and that. So when you create a life, you have to create a human life which contains in it both awe and dread. So you have to create a life in which you develop an attitude and a relationship towards both the awesomeness of life, the beauty, the joys, the pleasures of life, and the fact that we die and we're finite. So you have to develop an attitude of connection and relationship to that as you create your life. Most of us don't pay attention to the dread part. We try to deny it. And that's because it's full of fear, right?
Mm-hmm.
Dread, angst, it's all fear. And we were having a discussion with some people the other day, and I was making the point about dread, and fear.
Yeah, I remember.
Our bodies, evolutionarily, we have systems within our bodies. Our brain is automatically set to respond in fear to threats.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's the one thing that is very well developed, and it's existed in our brains for hundreds of thousands of years, if not longer, right? And it's the most primitive, basic apparatus within our brain, right? Most basic function of our brain, which is to make us run from being extinguished, make us run from something that threatens our existence, death, right? So we don't have to go very far, and we don't have to seek out things that are frightening, because life brings us all sorts of frightening things. And the seeds of our death we're born with them, right? We're born with them. In our genes are the seeds of what's going to age us, what's going to give us the diseases we're going to get. It's built into our finite. Our obsolescence is built in. We're like Apple computers. We weren't built to last forever. There was evolutionarily, I suppose, we were supposed to make room for the next versions of Homo sapiens.
Mm.
Like lemmings, at some point when there are too many of us, we have to walk off cliffs or something like that. But so we're built in to do that. But awe you have to seek out. Awe you have to look to fall in love with somebody. You have to have the courage to create a life, to appreciate the awe of the experience of falling in love with somebody, right? Or to create something of beauty, to create a life of meaning and intention and significance. You need courage to do that. You need to assert some intention and action, right?
Mm-hmm.
So our obligation is to create a life that's unique to us, right? Which is a big challenge, because not only, when we talk about life and talking about creating a life, we're talking about creating a life that we're given, right? We don't create ourselves. We're given this life. The other day, a few years ago, I was looking in the mirror, as I often do, and I was saying to myself, what is the one thing I know for absolute certainty? You know, the older you get, the more you know, the more you learn, the more things, the more you realize you don't know what you really don't know. You only know the smallest little bit of what there is to know in the world, right? You know how ignorant you are. So I said, what do I really know for certain? And I said to myself, the only thing I really know for certain, and I didn't always know this because I had the fantasy, like a lot of people, that I was adopted, because I looked at my parents and I go, they can't possibly be my parents. I'm nothing like them. I mean, these fools, how did they raise me? I mean, you know, and my brother definitely was adopted, I had this adopted. But I said to myself, and now I have this Jewish genetic disease that both my parents had. So I know that they were my parents, I know for certain. And I said to myself, the only thing I know for certain is that I am the son of Rose and Moshe Breitbart. That's all I know for certain. Everything else, I'm not 100% sure of. But that I know for sure. And what that really reflects is the fact that we have a connection to the past, present, and the future. We are part of a continuum of human beings, right? Our ancestors, there's a continuum from our ancestors through us to the future. There's a Doobie Brothers song called I'm Here to Love You, and there's one line that says, I think that passing love along is what we were born to do. So we're really creatures that are here to pass along maybe love, maybe knowledge, wisdom, our genes, right? All these kinds of things. There are researchers at Sloan Kettering Institute who think that the dominant life form on Earth is DNA, and the only purpose of human beings is to carry DNA from one generation to the next. We're just basically, delivery people. We're like a post office. We just deliver the DNA to the future. So basically, when you're when you're asking somebody, who are you? You're asking them, so who you're creating a life. Who are you trying to become in the world? And obviously that has a lot to do with what you were given by your family, by your ancestors. And what you were given, you had no choice about, right? I had no choice who my parents were going to be. I know you did, but Christian, right? But I didn't have a choice who my parents were going to be. I didn't have a choice of the genetics that I was going to be given. I didn't have a choice of what epoch, what era of time of the earth I was going to be born into. If I was born in the 1800s or late 1700s, 1800s in Poland, where my family was originally, I would have been a rabbi probably instead of a psychiatrist. We didn't choose that. I didn't choose to be born into a family, an Eastern European Jewish family on the Lower East Side. I could have been born in a favela in Rio de Janeiro. I could have been born in India and raised to think that God is a blue elephant. I could, right? It was none of that was under my control. So there was all this that I was given. In meaning centered psychotherapy, we call it the legacy that you're given. So you're given this legacy. You're given the genetics. You're given the culture. You're given the values. You're given one parent, two parents, grandparents, no grandparents. You're given the socioeconomic kinds of structure, where the culture, the country, whatever. And then you have to decide, when you create your own life, what am I going to preserve? What values will I preserve and make them central to my life? Or how is the life that I'm going to create, how is that going to be unique, right? Separate from theirs, different from theirs, but perhaps inspired by them in some way,
Mm-hmm.
uh, or perhaps rejecting them in some way, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I ask people, who are you? Who are you trying to become? And they have a very difficult time doing that. And who we become is composed of our attitudes towards the world, towards life, towards death, towards everything, right? Towards ourselves, our conscious, aware self, our values, our intention. What is our intention in the world? Um, you know, what impact do we want to have in the world? What significance do we have in the world? Significance is an interesting idea, and it boils down to every human being needs to feel that there was some sign that they were here in the world. Somebody saw them. And even if it's only your aware, conscious self that observes you constantly, even if that's your only witness to life, then at least there's been one witness. But so there's some sign, some significance. The word significance starts with the word sign, right? Some sign that it was here. So they have a hard time describing who they are, and who they want to become. They're very good. People are very good at saying what I want to do, and so that's where we start to talk about things like their families, their values, their attitudes toward the world, and what their intention with their lives is. And some people might call it the purpose, but I like the word intent. What do you intend to do with your life? Or what do you intend to do with the who that you are? And I sometimes describe, they have a difficult time. So I said, so I'm a person who is loving. I'm love, and my intention is to ease suffering in the world. And I do that through the work that I do. So the story that you heard me tell 8,000 times is the story of how did I become interested in being someone who impacts suffering in the world. And that's the story that I usually tell. And
You know,
yeah, go ahead, Christian.
yeah, just like I'm thinking about what you're saying right now, from Kierkegaard to the expression to our ability to respond to life as a self-aware human being, having dread and having awe, and being born in a specific time, geographic location, to a specific biological family, and how to use that we have to create ourselves, maximizing the amount of awe in our life, which is, in my opinion, maybe awe is almost a synonym of love, for our
Yeah.
self experience, and maybe also we could extend it to the experience of others. And then in an ideal world, then it becomes like the life we want to create is one to maximize our awe and the awe of others. And
That's correct. And I know yesterday you actually, I saw you nodding and smiling when I made an analogy about a tree, I think.
mm-hmm,
Do you
mm-hmm,
remember that? I was saying that trees, and other plants, there are roots, they don't move, right? We have legs and feet, and all that kind of stuff. We can move around. A tree is forced to get all of its all of its nutrition passively. If the sun comes out, it gets sunshine. If the sun doesn't come out, it's cloudy, it doesn't get sunshine. If it rains, it gets the water it needs. So it's passive. And that's a little bit like when I talk about dread and fear, we don't have to move around very much. It comes, life brings it to us all the time, you know.
Mhm.
Phone calls, emails, it comes over the internet. It you know, it comes through the air, aerosolizes virus. It'll find us, right?
Right.
Uh, but awe you have to go searching for. Meaning you have to go searching for. It wasn't a coincidence that Viktor Frankl called his book Man's Search for Meaning. You have to
Mhm.
go searching for meaning. You have to take particular actions. You have to have particular intentions. You have to. Now, there are a lot of people who live very meaningful lives accidentally and unintentionally. uh, but uh, but if you are aware of what some of the sources of meaning are, you know, love, connection, creativity, the attitudes that you take towards life, the historical context of life, then you can purposely go and create meaning in your life. You can create it and experience it and re-experience it. And you can seek out awe. You can seek out love. You can seek out pleasure. You can seek out adventures. You can take a trip to Guayaquil. You can do all sorts of things, or you can you know, take a psychedelic and have a mystical experience. That's awesome, right? Or go to the Grand Canyon, even better yet, cheaper or less dangerous. But so that was an interesting thing. Um, so what I often tell people is the story of, like, you know, of how I got, how my background, how my roots, how my ancestors, how my family, the experience of my family, and my influenced who I became in the world, and how I used that experience of my family and the environment and the parents I was raised by, the environment I grew up in, the time in history that I was born into, and all that, how that influenced how I use that to help me create who I am. And so I'll tell the story for your listeners, right? So my parents were both Holocaust survivors from Eastern Europe, from a small town of Poland. And when the war broke out, my mother was 14 years old and my father was 17. My mother, at age 14, the war broke out. My mother and her parents were hidden in a hole under the stove of a Catholic woman who sheltered them, who hid them in this hole under her stove in her barn. And she hid them for several years. My father was uh, sort of taken into the Russian army involuntarily as it came through town. And he happened to be at the end of a very long line. And he just quickly and slyly slipped into the forest, left the line, ran away. And he connected with a group of about 100, 150 partisans, partisan fighters. There were 100, 150 people. Some of them were middle-aged, some were older. There were families with young children. There were a lot of young people, anywhere from, you know, his age to the mid-20s, 30s. They were armed. They occasionally had to use those weapons to survive, to mainly fight off Ukrainians and Germans. Um, and you know, unlike those of us who had to go through stay-at-home orders from New York State, you know, they didn't have you know, in the forest. They didn't have Netflix or cell phones or internet or delivery from Whole Foods or anything like that. You know, so my father would have to go look for food, and he would go search for food. They would send out a little delegation of 3 or 4 guys with weapons to get food. And they came across this barn. They would look, and there were chickens in this barn. My father and I don't eat chicken. Um, like anyone else, I have a very different appreciation for chickens than most other people. My father was looking for chickens, and instead he found my mother. He broke into that barn. They broke into the barn looking for food, looking for chicken. And what would happen at night is my grandparents and my mother would come out from under that hole, in that stove in that hole, and they would actually fry the potato peels that were left by the this woman from the potatoes that she. And my father broke into this with this young man. He broke into the barn, and he found my mother and my grandparents. My father happened to be related to my grandmother. They were second cousins, so they knew each other from the same town. And my grandfather said to them, "You can't stay here. It's not safe. You have to come with us in the woods." My grandparents were too frightened, but they let my mother go. They told my mother, "You should go," because they thought she'd be safer in the woods with my father.
Wow.
So at this tender age of 14 and 17, my mother and father running around the woods together in the forest for about 3 years. And I remember when, basically the forest floor was their bed. The stars, the moon, the sky, night sky was their blanket. I once asked my mother, I said, "Mom, you and Dad, in the forest, you had to huddle with each other for warmth. The forest bed was your floor. The forest floor was your bed. Uh, seemed a little romantic to me." I said, "Did anything ever happen?" And my mother said in her Yiddish, Eastern European accent, "Darling, I should embarrass you." Didn't want to embarrass me. So, no. So apparently something happened. I don't know. But anyway, after the war, they went back to the farmhouse, and lo and behold, my grandparents were still there. And then they all walked across the border to Germany to a displaced persons camp for about 4 or 5 years until they all emigrated to New York. And I grew up on the Lower East Side in a walk-up tenement, in the Jewish Lower East Side. And like I describe often in certain pieces that I've written, I said, the Holocaust lived with us. The Holocaust, but it didn't have its own room where you could lock it up and just put it away. It lived in every room. It lived on all the walls. It lived in every photograph, that was preserved from the war. It lived on every religious article that my father or my grandfather managed to save. I remember my father kept the Jewish star that Jews were forced to sew on their clothing, which said Yud. It was on that too. I used to keep that at my bedside as a 4-year-old. Can you imagine?
Oh my God.
And
why did what was there a specific purpose to keeping that?
for keeping it?
No.
Yes, to never forget what happened. Yes, to never forget. And it wasn't so much never forget the horror or never forget the fact that there was so much genocide. It was to never forget the people who didn't have a chance to live. All the relatives, my mother's brothers, my father's entire family. Never forget those who never lived. But a lot of people, never forget is in Hebrew the word for the Holocaust is called Shoah, and it's a very common thing for people to be determined never to forget the Shoah. It's a little bit like slavery, we can't forget it, that it happened. It was too important and too monumental, it changed the world in such a way that you can never lose sight of that fact. Maybe you can forgive, but you can't forget, right? And I kept it out of superstition, I believe. But so I grew up with my parents telling me all these stories of how they survived, but also of all the people who died and all the people who never had a chance to have lives, right? And so for me as a 4-year-old, death was very real. And I was very aware of death. I could not deny death. So in this process of creating who you are, where a lot of people create a life, a human life that has both awe and dread in it, I could not deny the dread. I had to create a life in which dread was a part of it. And I had to develop an attitude towards death. I had to find a way to relate to death. And actually, what I had to find was a way to relate to the suffering caused by being in that space between life and death, which is where my parents were for so many years, right? In the woods. And uh, and so death was very real to me. And every morning when my mother would make breakfast for me and then eventually my younger brother, she would ask us the same question. She would ask me, actually, because I was the firstborn. She said, "Why am I here? Why am I here?" The full question was, why am I here and everyone else is dead? Why did I survive and no one else did? Hardly anyone else did. And that was the question. It turned out that I was the answer. Uh, Now, I don't remember if my mother actually ever spoke those words or I just got that message, non-verbally. But the expectation was, the burden placed on me was that it was my parents survived to get to the new world, New York, and and live long enough so that I could be born, and that it was up to me to create a life and to become someone who had such a significant impact on the world, particularly in the arena of suffering, particularly in that space, between that nexus between life and death, that my achievements, my impact on suffering being so significant was going to obviously redeem them in terms of their survival. That they would be able to say, you see, of course we had to survive, because if we didn't survive, there wouldn't be a Bill Breitbart in the world. They didn't call me Bill, they called me by my Yiddish name, Belville. But so my burden was to become this person, right? Now, and I grew up in a community with a lot of kids. I went to all boys schools. A lot of my classmates grew up in very similar homes with very similar stories. And for many of us, this burden, like it was for me, turned into an inspiration. I created my life in response to that, partially and uniquely. My parents actually wanted me to be a cardiologist. They thought that was, but they didn't know that they had created someone who was meant to ease suffering. They didn't know what I was supposed to do. They just knew I was supposed to do something. I was supposed to justify their survival. They didn't quite have it all figured out. And so for me, it was an inspiration, and for a lot of my classmates, it was an inspiration. So you have no idea how many psychiatrists came out of my class. Psychiatrists, neuropsychiatrists, philosophers. I mean, it's incredible, the concentration from my neighborhood and the class that I was in Orthodox Jewish school. But then for some of my classmates, it was a crushing burden. The burden was crushing. And though I sometimes joke that those are the guys in my class who became dentists. You weren't allowed to fall below that level.
Right.
That you just inflict pain for a living. But and so it's no coincidence that I ended up at Memorial Sloan Kettering, working with developing and working in the area of psychiatric palliative care, and then starting to and having my research evolve from, I trained both in medicine and psychiatry because I was struggling with how do I heal people? How do I heal suffering? Do I heal the body or do I heal the soul? The psyche. And it turned out I I was destined to be at that nexus between the psyche and the soma, you know, psychosomatic. Psyche is actually mind and spirit, Greek, as a not, it's not really a dichotomy of mind and body. It's the mind, body, spirit. So I was really the spirit doctor. And psychiatrists are doctors of the soul, psyche. That's what we are. Uh, but I put myself in the environment of where people were dealing with facing death. They were unavoidably having to face their mortality because of the cancer. But in the beginning, I wasn't quite certain about where I had to be, and so I moved back and forth between medicine and psychiatry, and then I found myself doing fellowship in at Sloan Kettering, and I started doing research on medical aspects of psychiatric aspects of medical problems, depression, delirium, drug trials, and fatigue, pain, and then I landed in the world of existential despair, desire for haste and death, things like that. And then reverted back to medical stuff like what happens if you treat depression and desire for hate. Oh, it gets better. But then I stumbled on meaning, loss of meaning and hope, and I really got to do work in the arena of meaning and existence and what it and who you are. How do you sustain a life of meaning and still experience awe, knowing that this is just temporary? How do you thrive even in that space of temporary existence? And that's the story.
It's a beautiful story. And thank you for telling this story. It gets better every time. I think that there are extra details that I did not know about your grandparents and how your dad came to the picture. So I really do appreciate it. And like thinking about specifically the meaning in the middle of suffering, that's something that it's sometimes hard to grasp, right? Like we have some degree of suffering that, okay, maybe we have sometimes family members will die, sometimes we will embrace breakup, some physical illness. To some extent we do experience suffering, but at some point as we get older and we get more sick, and in the case of our patients, when cancer comes into the picture, and sometimes terminal cancer and really really difficult to treat cancer, it can be hard for a cancer patient to say, how can I thrive in the middle of all this suffering? And surprisingly, I mean, yeah, it's possible. And I've had patients that have done so beautifully, and I love to create that comparison with Viktor Frankl, who was able to truly find meaning in the middle of being trapped in that concentration camp. It's
Yeah.
not exactly the same as cancer, but like the one thing that disease or Nazis can't fully take away from you is your attitude towards your
Right.
life.
The way you think about things, yes. But that and this whole idea of the attitudinal sources of meaning. In other words, you can choose your attitude towards suffering. So that was the hardest thing for me to understand. And and I finally grew to understand it in a slightly different way. I mean, it's the same thing, but um, who you are comes back to who you are and authenticity. Who you are is you. What makes up who you are is your attitude, right? Your perspective on things, your attitude, the way you think about things, right? Uh, being who you are authentically, right? Now, how can it? How can you experience beauty and joy in something that's in suffering, right? How can you how can you experience meaning in the face of suffering? Um, My father, I sat with my father as he was dying for the last 18 hours of his life, holding his hand, sitting beside him, sometimes lying beside him in his bed, my mother on the other side. It was one of the most beautiful experiences of my life. The last thing I did just before he died is he was unshaven, and my father was the manager of a restaurant, and he was an impeccable man in the sense of he had to always be clean shaven, wear a crisp suit so that he could be the face of this very famous restaurant on the Lower East Side. And he had about 2 weeks of stubble, and I knew he wouldn't want to die unshaven. So I started to shave him. I put lather on his face, and I shaved one half of his face, and I got to the middle of the face. Half the job was done, and my mother was in the kitchen cleaning dishes or something, and he exhaled and died. And I stood there for a second, and I said, do I call my mother in and tell her that Dad died? Or do I finish the job and then call my mother in? And I've asked hundreds, thousands of people what they would have done. Everyone basically says the same thing. They said, I would have finished the job. Is that what you would have said?
That's exactly what I was thinking.
So that's what I did. I finished the job, and then I called my mother in. I was holding my father's hand. He was unconscious, and I could feel his pulse. Every beat of his pulse, right, was an expression of love for me. It was just, it was, so how could you say that my father dying was beautiful? But it was, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think what it boils down to is the fact of who we are. When we experience anything, whether it be joyous or tragic, when we do it uniquely, authentically as a human being, the way only a human being can do it, we experience meaning. So if you're dying and you die as only a human being dies, that's meaningful. If you're giving birth, if you're a human woman giving birth to a human child, and only the way a human being can give birth, that is meaningful. It's authentically human. So if we are being our true, authentic human selves, and if even more so, being able to still still hold on to the essence of who we are authentically, a loving person, right? If my death is about loving everyone, and if my death is not about me, but about teaching everyone else not to be afraid of death, then it's meaningful, it's beautiful, right? So that's my idea of attitude, right? In the face of choosing attitudes of suffering. That's how there can be beauty, there can be joy, there can be meaning in suffering. I wouldn't go out of my way to find suffering, to experience. Avoidable suffering should be avoided, but inevitably in life, Viktor Frankl called it the tragic triad of life. In life, you will inevitably encounter death, suffering, and guilt. And what he meant was existential guilt. We call it the tragic triad of life. If you get old enough, you realize it's true. The existential guilt, and that also falls into the whole idea of who you are, right?
Right.
The idea of existential guilt is that you did not fully become who you could have been, right?
You didn't fully become who you could have been. Yeah, you will never be.
No, but hardly anybody achieves
Yeah.
that, right? So we're all die with a little bit of existential guilt, and that's why it's important to be able to forgive yourself. Yeah. And that's where love comes in. It's a lot easier to forgive anybody you love. And that's why it's important to cultivate love for yourself, because ultimately in your lifetime, you're going to have to forgive yourself for what your regrets, what you didn't achieve, what you didn't accomplish, the jobs you didn't finish.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I think I think we should close the episode with that.
Yes.
It's a beautiful episode. Basically, I'm gonna name it "Who Are You?"
Who are you?
Who are
Okay.
you? Yeah. And well, thank you so
Thank
much
you,
for
Christian.
what. Yeah, I think that I have learned just listening to you for these last hours. So I really do appreciate
I appreciate it too. I hope you get a lot of fan mail from this.
it. Well, if I get hate mail, I'll let you know too.
Okay, tell me about the hate mail too. I have ways of dealing with haters. All right.
Okay,
If nobody hates you, then you didn't really stand for anything.
I agree 100%.
Okay, Christian. Ciao.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.